Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe makes history paying homage to the war dead in Pearl Harbor, but Japan's neighbors are unimpressed. And we pick the creative mind of China's contemporary poet Xi Chuan, who introduced the genius of haiku to generations. And we begin today's show with a historic meeting between Japan and the United States. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe becomes the first Japanese leader, as he described it, to visit Pearl Harbor with the U.S. president. It's been 75 years since Japan carried out an attack on the naval base that drew the United States into World War II. The visit comes 6 months after U.S. President Barack Obama became the first sitting American president to visit Hiroshima to pay homage to victims of the U.S. atomic bomb of that city at the end of the same war.
Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has laid wreaths and visited memorials in Hawaii ahead of a visit to the site of the 1941 aerial bombing that plunged the United States into the Second World War. An official apology is not on the agenda during the Prime Minister's visit. However,
on that occasion, I'm very much looking forward to sending out a strong message about the value of reconciliation, as well as our sincere prayers for those who died in the war.
On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor and killed over 2,000 Americans. Abe's trip is widely believed to be an attempt to relieve Japan of its past war debts to the U.S. In contrast, the wartime legacy still plagues Japan's relations with China and other Asian countries. China's foreign ministry says Shinzo Abe's visit to Pearl Harbor will not resolve all historical issues from World War II.
A visit to Pearl Harbor cannot settle historical accounts. Don't forget that China was the main eastern battlefield in the global anti-fascist war, and the Chinese people made massive national sacrifice to achieve victory. Japan would never turn over this page until it reconciled with China and other Asian countries it invaded.
The meeting takes on a special significance, coming just 4 weeks before the swearing-in of President-elect Donald Trump, who has sent mixed and sometimes contradictory messages as to the future of American policy in Asia. Japanese media speculate that Abe's visit is designed to send a signal that the strong alliance between the former wartime adversaries remains firm. But after Mr. Trump takes office in January, it remains to be seen if he will indeed deliver on his many campaign promises. Changes will no doubt come to Japan-US relations.
For more on Abe's visit to Pearl Harbor, we are now joined in Beijing by Professor Su Hao, Director of the Center for Strategic and Peace Studies at the China Foreign Affairs University. Joining us in Washington, D.C. in the U.S., Kurt Volker, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO and also CEO of the McCain Institute for International Leadership. We are also looking forward to a Japanese panelist joining us later in our program. But I want to begin with you, Mr. Volker. Help us to understand, how do the Americans understand the significance of Mr. Abe's visit? And how do you reflect upon the criticisms going on here in Asia toward that specific visit to Pearl Harbor?
Well, I think the context with the United States is very different from Japan's relations with countries in Asia itself. We've had a very strong alliance with Japan for 50 years. The U.S. defeated Japan during the war. We have not apologized for the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And yet, Abe visiting Pearl Harbor, participating in a ceremony to honor those killed, is a significant step, a significant gesture, even without an apology, and I think it's going to be welcomed in the United States.
We are also joined by Professor Takasato Watanabe, who is joining us from Tokyo in Japan, a professor emeritus at Doshisha University. Professor Watanabe, we just heard from Ambassador Volker talking about the U.S. relations with Japan, very different from, of course, Japan's relations with its neighbors. What do you make as an intellectual, outspoken intellectual, I would say, in Japan about Prime Minister Abe's choice of visiting Pearl Harbor, but not necessarily the other places in which the atrocities of the Second World War was also felt in this part of the world?
if we look into only the very narrow place of the world, Japan and the United States relations, the visit of Mr. Abe to Pearl Harbor might be good for some elite class of Japan and also for the ordinary Americans. However, globally speaking, if the Abe apologizes or visits Pearl Harbor, it means that he is liable to forget other places who are victimized by the military forces of the United States, represented by China, Korea, or some other Asian countries. And also on the same day of the Pearl Harbor attack, the Malay Peninsula, or Sydney, or some other small islands, nations of Asia were attacked. So these places were, you see, never appear on the history of the mind of the Japanese people if the Abe's visit is so largely written.
Professor Watanabe, before I go to other panelists, I still want to follow up by asking you, because as we have seen some media reports, both in Japan and the United States, indicated very clearly this is visit not necessarily as what Prime Minister Abe earlier described as the first sitting prime minister to visit the Pearl Harbor, but rather there were already 3 other visits by previous Prime Minister of Japan, quietly rather, to the Pearl Harbor, even though it was not widely reported at the time for whatever reasons. So when you look at this, and Prime Minister Abe's tendency of describe this as unprecedented, what do you think are the goals and the agendas behind this specific action and move?
In Japan, for the past 3 decades or so, media of Japan were telling that nobody apologized or visited Pearl Harbor or Hawaii attacked areas. So Mr. Abe was positioned to be the first one, but actually before that, as you have pointed out, 3 prime ministers, including Mr. Yoshida Shigeru, visited the Pearl Harbor area and prayed for the dead, for the victims, both in the United States and in Japan. So that is the wrong story made by the spin doctors of the Japanese government surrounding Prime Minister Abe.
Okay.
So many youngsters are misunderstanding this.
Ambassador Volker, I see the smile on your face when you listen to the words from Professor Watanabe. Of course, different people have different perspectives, also in Japan as well. But Professor Volker, this time the Prime Minister of Japan was about to express, quote, remorse about what happened. Of course, as you may know, when it comes to history and facts and emotions related to them, words and the meanings behind words sometimes could be extremely important. That is why there are a lot of things that have not necessarily been solved in this part of the world, in Asia, between Japan and its neighbors. So what do Americans or people like you make of the so-called remorse, a word that the Prime Minister Abe likely to use in his possible speech? Ambassador Volker.
Yeah, I think in the case of the United States, again, as I said, it's a little different, and I think people will accept that as a genuine statement just for what it is. Smiling because of the spin doctor comment, I think it's exactly right. I think Professor Watanabe is exactly right, is trying to find the right words to convey only what they want to convey. And he also makes a very good point about other countries in Asia. I think that there it is obviously much, much more sensitive, more delicately felt in many countries, China included, Korea included. And there I think that it would be important at some point for Japan to go farther. I think the United States is not so worked up about this, but in other countries it does matter. And I think Japan's responsibility at the beginning of World War II is something that many countries still feel as something that Japan does not acknowledge fully.
I want to go back now to Professor Su sitting here in Beijing with me. You were attentively listened to your colleagues in Washington, D.C. and in Tokyo. Professor Su, at this point, I understand there are a lot of criticism coming from China toward the Prime Minister's apparent choice of only going to the Pearl Harbor to express, quote unquote, his remorse, but not necessarily to South Korea, not to China, not to Vietnam, not to also some of the Southeast Asian countries. But what can you do about it? I mean, what can China do about it? On the one hand, Japan and the United States have very close allied relationship. On the other hand, you do read through the recent developments certain tendencies of the Abe administration to cut itself from the past in a way, to move Japan. So what can China do now except expressing dissatisfaction and criticism?
Yes, we know that historical issue is really the important is the unsolved problem between China and Japan regarding the Japanese aggressive war against China, and it makes China suffer seriously in the we call it anti-Japanese war. So this time, Prime Minister Abe visited Pearl Harbor regarding the so-called pays the mournings to the American victims in the Pearl Harbor attack. That means that Japan would like to try to show its special relation with Japan, with United States. But we know that United States in a wartime it was the ally of China, and also suffered from Japanese aggressive, offensive, attack in Hawaii.
Right.
So that means we are the common problems.
But Professor Su, let's just be frank here. Before the Pearl Harbor attack, the United States was not actively involved at all in the fight against the Japanese or the Germany at the time during the Second World War, only after that. Meanwhile, you see atrocities in this part of Asia were not known to the rest of the world in a big way, in the way it should because of the numbers of people being killed here, until there are Western scholars try to unveil the part of history. For example, about Nanking Massacre.
Yeah.
Without Ulrich Chan, probably the rest of the world still do not know the truth about Nanking Massacre. Ulrich Chan, by the way, is an American journalist, a female journalist who passed away also. Well, we want to express our appreciation for their work. There is the sadness that life here apparently does not worth the life there.
Right.
Where is, if people could say it, the so-called equality when it comes to life? People are born equal. A life here is exactly a life there.
Yes.
So, Professor Su, I want to have your reflection about this reality. How do you see this reality? What can we do about this reality?
Okay. Yes, actually, it's that I just mentioned that United States and China, we are the allies against the Japan in the Japanese so-called the Pacific War against both of us. So we have suffered seriously, in this war. Actually, in China, before the Pearl Harbor attack, we already engaged in a war against the Japanese aggressive, against us.
That's right.
And the United States, after Pearl Harbor, so they become the ally with China against Japan. So we are at that time, we are the equals, positions to be engaged into the war against Japan. So we are the equal, at that time.
Right.
So regarding their casualties in a war, Chinese and Japanese and United States Americans is also suffered seriously about that. So I think that's China and Japan, China and the United States, we could take the same stand, regarding the Japanese aggressive war.
All right,
But
you want to put that
unfortunately,
that
yes.
challenge to your American colleague. Of course, we understand Ambassador Volker does not speak for the American government, but I want to have your reflection, sir, as well, and your intellectual analysis about this fact, the fact that I just mentioned, that it has to take the West to unveil this part of history for the world to really take it seriously, and why a life here is not equal to a life there. Many would ask this question. Ambassador Volker.
Well, I don't think anyone would agree with you in suggesting that a life in Asia is not equal to a life anywhere else in the world.
I'm
I
not
think they would share
suggesting
that
it. I'm
sentiment
just
very, very
trying
much.
to explain an apparent reality, which is sad.
Well, it's not an apparent reality. It is perhaps a perception that some people hold in Asia or in other parts of the world, but it's certainly not a perception held here. And as far as the history goes, I think it actually has been the United States and the West that have portrayed a much more dispassionate portrayal, dispassionate accounting of what happened during World War II, including with Japan. In Japan itself, I think that it's still very mixed. You know, I had a chance a year and a half ago to visit one of the shrines in Japan, and the history there is a very different history, the way it is conveyed as compared with the way that you would hear that in the West. I think it is there. What I do think is, as I said, I think that Japan is taking a step by, and Prime Minister Abe is taking a step by visiting Pearl Harbor, participating in a ceremony, honoring the victims there. I would hope that that's the beginning of a further journey for Prime Minister Abe and Japan in showing more acknowledgement of Japan's role in all of these atrocities and events in the 1930s and the 1940s, just as your Chinese guest has said.
I see. Professor Watanabe, before I let you to respond to Ambassador Volker's comments, we want to take a comparison here. It is not the first time, not even 100th time that we make this comparison, but it's still worthwhile to compare what happened in Japan and in Germany after the Second World War. Germany is seen as a good example by many of a nation admitting to its war crimes, especially when compared to Japan after the war. In Germany, the whole wartime history and Nazi crime was tackled in at least 5 subjects at school, often in great depth. After World War II, those responsible for wartime atrocities were prosecuted, tried, and punished. In contrast, many Japanese textbooks try to cover up Japan's aggression. Many young Japanese don't know much about the Pearl Harbor attack, but know about Japan as a victim in the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan did not clean its political house, and many war criminals and suspected war criminals also came back to serve in the post-war government. Not to mention a visit of the shrines in Tokyo, for example, every time by important politicians in Japan. Professor Watanabe, I know you are outspoken about this. But still, reality is in your country. Do you think, by what Ambassador Volker's call and many others from your allies, such as the United States, after this trip, Prime Minister Abe would have a second thought about how to approach the history, also with Japan's Asian neighbors? Will textbooks be able to reflect a little bit more of what really happened in history? Will there be opportunity for Prime Minister Abe not only to expand the military, but really to talk about history with the neighbors? Professor Watanabe, my question is very long, but I want to make clear what we are talking about here.
Thank you. There are 2 reasons why Mr. Abe is doing like that and visited Pearl Harbor this time. The first one is internal politics. The coalition government of LDP, Komeito, is liable to depart from the coalition, so Komeito is peace-loving party. Then Abe was forced to follow the idea of the Komeito to respond back to the Komeito's supporters to visit the Pearl Harbor. And next one is the international one. In Japan, the influence of the socialist countries like Soviet Union at that time was so strong. And United States and other leading nations of the Allied after the war, they wanted to have the Japan out of the influence of the Russia and socialist countries, including China and North Korea. So Japan were not is obliged to follow the way of the making the war criminals the criminals of the society, inside the society. So that's a big difference. between Japan and Germany.
Yes, indeed. Professor Su, many have asked that question, and I have to ask it out loud as well in this program because we have a real discussion here.
Yeah.
Professor Su, that is, what is really this about? Is this really about reflection about history by Prime Minister Abe? Or this is about building stronger ties with the ally in order to guarantee its freedom or a space for Japan's military buildup and further stronger interaction against its neighbors in Asia? I think that is the fundamental question I have to ask here. Professor Su.
Well, first of all, I have to say that our American guests say that history is different. But I have to say that history is fact. But the problem is that we have the different interpretation about history from the United States, in particular from Japan, but of course from China. We have very clear fact to support that China was real sufferers in this war. Well, but the problem is because based upon their strategic needs, Japan and the United States, we know they are allied with each other. In particular, at the moment, they're actually stronger. They're allied with each other to enhance their military's deployment in the West Pacific against, the Eastern continent. So that makes these two countries try to, to ignore some historical fact and to create some kind of the common sense to enhance their relation with each other. Right. So the reason why, interpretation, there be difference.
I see this specific visit is very interpreted differently in this part of the world. Final word, just to be fair, also Ambassador Volker, we got 10 seconds left, but final word from you as well, Ambassador.
Yes, I think that the relationship between the U.S. and Japan is already very strong, and that helps create some of the conditions for the visit, rather than the visit trying to do something to strengthen U.S. support for Japan. I think it's the other way around.
All right, Ambassador Kurt Volker, Professor Takasato Watanabe, and Professor Su Hao. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us and express your perspectives. We'll see how history is being portrayed and reflected in the future. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, still to come on our program.
I try to write
a brilliant poet in his own right, Xi Chuan from China also spread the word on the seminal work of his contemporary, Hai Zi, to the younger generation here in China and around the world. Meet the poet up close after the break. You're still watching World Insight, coming to you Monday to Friday on CCTV News. In the 1980s, as China was just beginning to give the world a glimpse of its rich heritage, there was a blossoming of literature and art among the younger generation. Many brilliant young poets at the time breathed life into words that moved, the inspired, enlightened, and invigorated readers. Earlier, I spoke with one of China's contemporary poets, Xi Chuan. He shared his unique insight at the wordsmith and how he approaches his and other artists' work with such poetic license. Most notably, he introduced to a bigger audience, both here in China and around the world, the seminal work of his contemporary, Hai Zi. Before the exclusive interview, take a look at this.
Some say poetry is either genius or madness. In late 20th century, China has seen several outstanding poets. Their works are immortalized in people's mind and have inspired generations after them. Debasement is the password of the base, nobility the epitaph of the noble. I love not only your statelessness, but also your firm stand, the earth beneath you. Even with these dark eyes, a gift of the dark night, I go to seek the shining light. Among them, Hai Zi is one of the most beloved poets, who committed suicide at the age of 25. His death is regarded as a turning point in contemporary Chinese literature. As his best friend, poet Xi Chuan has edited the complete poems of Hai Zi, which includes illustrations drawn by Hai Zi himself.
Hai Zi's poem in Chinese. 黑夜从大地上升起，遮住了光明的天空。丰收后荒凉的大地，黑夜从你内部上升。你从远方来， 我到远方去，遥远的路程经过这里，黑夜一无所有，为何给我安慰？
Although his poetic oeuvre is relatively small, his archetypal descriptions of the rural and natural world, now virtually extinguished by industrialization, have a lyric intensity that is richly evocative. At that passionate and romantic age, the two poets shared a great time.
Because I know that Haizi is a genius. There's a young artist, young stage director. Every year she directs a play in memory of Haizi. And she always used the word genius. And I told her, for you, genius is a word. For me, that's a person with flesh. I feel that I was lucky to be Haizi's friend and Luo Yihe's friend in 1980s.
You are not just a friend. You were actually the one who worked very hard to push their poetry in front of the public eyes. You were a promoter.
I'm the editor of Haizi's complete poems, the book. That is about 1,100 pages. So that's a thick book, like a dictionary.
What about that complete work of Haizi? When you were editing it,
at that time, I didn't have a laptop or a computer, so I have to copy his poems in handwriting. So usually I worked for 1 week in copying his poems, and then I stopped for 1 week, and then I need a week for my own writing. And then next week should be a week for Haizi. And sometimes I felt that Haizi, he wrote some dreadful poems about ghosts, about bones, about these things. So I remember that one night I had to stop in writing. And I have to stop to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I felt that I should stop in doing this if a ghost will emerge suddenly. But then after 10, nothing happened. So I went on with my work in editing his poems. And that was also a hard time for me. And suddenly I felt that I was alone in this world. And also I was at a loss, not only because of Haizi and Luo Yihe's deaths, but also because of the big change of the Chinese society.
I remember you were talking about yourself and the way you felt about yourself. You said you, quote, became a useless man. That was the time when you lost your two friends.
I don't know. Later I feel that I became a blind person. In 1980s, I felt that I had aims or one big aim, that is to be a writer, to be a poet, and to know whom you are. But later I lost this aim, so I told others that I became a blind person. I have to confess to myself that I don't know who I am. And I need to understand myself, not only about me, myself, but also about the society, also about the history, also about the life and death.
What about the society? What about the history? What questions you were urgently looking for answers?
About God. Although I'm not a Christian.
Religious?
No, I'm not religious. But let me take this as an example. Before, I felt that I know the face of God. But later I felt that maybe I need to know something about the back of God. And then I tried to turn to the back of God to see to see it. So it's...
Is the end of naivety?
Yeah, that's a good word. Naive.
Or the end
naivety.
of the innocence. Those are very...
Oh yes, that's a good word. You know, English poet William Blake, and William Blake said that a person at the beginning of his life, he lived an innocent life, and then he had to get into a step of experience or experiences. So I felt that in 1990s, I stepped onto this step of experience, and he had a poem called Tiger. So tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. But then he had another poem that is Lamb. And so he took lamb and on the one hand, and the other hand is tiger.
And since then, you become a tiger or a lamb?
No.
I just want to use an analogy, because are you a totally different person since then? You graduated in a way?
I don't know how to put it, but before I understood bright things, luminous things. But
Aspirations.
Later, yes. And but later I felt that I need to know something about the evil things and the dark side of life.
Did you have any poems about that?
Oh.
Yourself being, in a way, very observing.
Yeah, later I got an ability, I have to say, I got an ability of understanding absurdities.
Do you like yourself, the one you had back in the 1980s, or you like yourself even better after you see or after you saw the back of the God?
You know, young people, younger than me, they sometimes ask me to tell them some stories about from 1980s, but I always tell them that I'm not a person who's always feel nostalgia for 1980s. I think only those people who had accomplished their jobs. So I think it is their right to think about 1980s again and again. But me, I feel that I'm a person still working. Still walking and working. And so I seldom go back to 1980s.
Not one to be comfortable dwelling in the past, Xi Chuan, the well-respected Chinese contemporary poet, exposed himself to all kinds of uncertainties and unknowns. He began to play with new ideas in his poetry, experiments one after another for reincarnation. Unlike many of his generation of poets who eventually left, he dares to continue to experience his life and work as a poet.
Between poetry and history, or between poetry and philosophy, or between poetry, maybe a religion or something else.
That's very interesting.
It's between us.
Can you give us some examples?
After 1992, I started to write prose poems. And lots of Chinese readers, they were not used to my way of writing after 1992. And they feel that that's not poetry, because ordinary people, they understand that poetry should be in lines with rhymes.
You want to break that?
Yeah, I want to.
What did you do?
I brought some ideas into poetry writing. I feel that poetry is not, poetry, this word is not only for lyrical poetry, because usually people feel that to talk about, to give ideas, that's a task of philosophers. But I feel that poets also have, they need to at least to know something about these philosophical things.
What did you write then?
I have a series of poems. There's one, the title is What the Eagle Says. I'm trying to talk in a crazy way, I have to say. Oh, I have another series of poems. That is, I try to give definitions to words. For instance, bird. And bird, you have a definition in a dictionary. And I'm trying to give new definitions. I invented. Not only about birds, about city, about this term city, this word, about what else? Fire or shadow. And I try to give the definition in a very official way. But
Xithuan's official version.
But what I talk there, what I have there, could be something absurd.
We are very much looking forward to listening to those poems.
Yeah. Grandmother. My grandmother coughs, waking 1,000 roosters. 1,000 roosters crow, waking 10,000 people. 10,000 people walk out of the village. Roosters in the village still crowing. The crowing roosters stop. My grandmother still coughing. My still coughing grandmother mentions her grandmother, her voice getting softer, as if it were my grandmother's grandmother's voice getting softer. My grandmother talks and talks, then stops, shutting her eyes, as if it were only now that my grandmother's grandmother really died.
What interests you the most these days that you would like eventually put it on paper?
I've just finished a very long essay on Tang poetry.
Poetry from China's Tang Dynasty.
Tang Dynasty, yes. Chinese people, it seems that the Chinese people had a definite way of in reading these poets. So I'm trying to tell something new, to tell something fresh, to give new ways in reading these poets.
But why? I mean, Xithuan, why? Chinese society is changing so fast.
Yes.
Why do you have to go back?
Actually, you've given me the answer. That is, the Chinese society changed so rapidly, and then because of this, right? Because of this, I am having a way of looking at Tang Dynasty society.
What do you mean by that?
For instance, what's the relationship between poetry writing and the social changes? And you can't read Tang poetry only according to, only as dead poems, only as knowledge. But they are heritages for us. But the poets from Tang Dynasty, when they were writing the poems, they were writing just like us writing at this time. The social changes, gives me such an opportunity to find something new there in Tang poetry.
What did you find?
Because, for instance, in Tang Dynasty, there are also monk poets. And so beside Li Bai and Du Fu, there were poets like Han Shan, who's very famous in other countries, in the United States, in Europe. His name was translated into like this, the Cold Mountain. But in Chinese, that's Han Shan. And, but Han Shan was not the only monk poet from Tang Dynasty. There is another person, his name is Wang Fanzhi, and also a very famous monk of Zen Buddhism, Huineng. They wrote, because Tang poets, they were elites. But these monk poets, they wrote with a kind of vernacular Chinese. They were away from the mainstream of the Tang Dynasty. And that, for me, that's quite interesting.
It's very interesting to talk about, you got to know the God at the very beginning when you were very young. And then you got to know, as you see it, the back of the God. And now, it seems that you try to see within yourself
Yeah, I also want to know my limitations. So my possibilities and also my limitations. I have to say that my brain is crowded with concepts from the Western world. Well, then I traveled to countries like India, like Turkey, like Egypt. Because of my experiences of traveling to these less advanced countries, I feel that maybe the whole issue is not so simple. So I always ask myself questions.
Well, that is Xi Chuan, one of those well-known contemporary Chinese poets who tries very hard to piece together the real picture of the reality and the history. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of a program, visit our website. Just type World Insight CCTV News into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.